10 cover-ups finally exposed.
Atlantis. You already know the name, Atlantis. You've seen it in movies, games, documentaries you half-watched at 2 a.m. But here's the question nobody actually answers for you. Why does a story every historian calls fiction still get treated like a crime scene? Stick with us on this one. Hit subscribe now if you haven't, because there are 9 more stories like it coming right after this. The tale comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, and if you trace it back, he claimed he didn't invent it. He was repeating a story passed down from Egyptian priests who told him Atlantis existed roughly 9,000 years before his time. Do the math yourself, and that number lines up almost exactly with the end of the Younger Dryas, a real abrupt period of climate change and sea level rise around 11,600 years ago. That's not something Plato could have guessed at. Most historians will tell you Atlantis is allegory, a fable about the dangers of pride, nothing more. But if you look at Giza, you'll find something harder to wave off. In the 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch and Egyptologist John Anthony West ran seismic surveys around the Sphinx and reported signs of a hidden chamber beneath its pores. A 1,978 Stanford Research Institute survey flagged the same kind of anomaly nearby. And if you've ever tried to find out what's actually down there, you've hit the same wall everyone else has. Egyptian authorities have denied excavation requests for decades, citing preservation. Then, in March 2025, you probably saw it cross your feed. Italian researchers claiming radar scans had found a vast underground complex, shafts and chambers reaching over 2,000 feet beneath Giza. Before you get too excited, here's what you should know. It was announced through a press conference, not a peer-reviewed paper, and Egypt's former antiquities chief Zahi Hawass called it fake news outright, with independent experts questioning whether the technology used could even reach that deep. Mainstream archaeology hasn't accepted it. So if you're waiting for Atlantis to be proven or disproven once and for all, keep waiting. It's sitting exactly where it's always been, behind a door nobody will open for you. The Ark of the Covenant. Picture yourself trying to track down the most sought-after object in religious history. You'd need to check a jungle vault, a desert cave, and a small stone chapel guarded by one monk who isn't allowed to leave. That's the actual, current state of this mystery. According to the Book of Exodus, the Ark was a gold-covered chest built to hold the 10 Commandments, something you'd assume would leave a clear paper trail. It didn't. It's mentioned in Solomon's Temple, and then, sometime before the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in 587 BC, it simply disappears from the record, no account of it being destroyed. No account of it being stolen. If you go looking for the exact moment it vanished, you won't find one. So, theories filled in the blank for you. Jewish tradition says the prophet Jeremiah hid it in a cave in the Judean desert, a claim serious enough that it's driven actual illegal digs near Mount Nebo. Others will tell you it never left Jerusalem, sealed in a chamber beneath the Temple Mount, a site so politically charged you'll never see it excavated in your lifetime. Medieval legend hands it to the Knights Templar, smuggled to Europe. And in Ethiopia, you can visit the Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion, where clergy insist the Ark has sat for centuries, guarded by one man chosen for life, a man you are not permitted to see it in order to verify. Notice the pattern. Every place you might actually find an answer is a place someone with power has made sure stays closed to you. MK Ultra. If you think government cover-ups are just internet conspiracy talk, this is the one that should change your mind, because the US government has already admitted this one happened. In the early 1950s, fear that American POWs had been brainwashed during the Korean War pushed the CIA into a mind control program you were never meant to hear about. Starting in 1953, the agency funneled money into roughly 150 sub-projects at universities and hospitals across the US and Canada. And if you'd been one of the doctors involved, there's a real chance you wouldn't even have known the CIA was funding you. One branch, Operation Midnight Climax, used sex workers to lure unsuspecting men into CIA safe houses, where they were secretly drugged while agents watched from behind one-way glass. In Montreal, a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron ran experiments you'd struggle to believe if they weren't declassified, sedating patients into extended comas, applying electroshock therapy at intensities far beyond any accepted medical standard, looping recorded messages through speakers thousands of times, to try to erase and rebuild a person's mind from scratch. Patients who checked in for treatment came out with amnesia and psychological damage that never healed. In 1973, as Congress started asking questions, the CIA ordered almost every MK Ultra record destroyed, an attempt to make sure you'd never see any of it. It nearly worked. A small batch of financial documents survived by accident. A 1977 Freedom of Information request pulled them into daylight. Journalist John Marks turned them into a book. And the Senate's Church Committee hearings forced the agency to publicly admit the program was real. What you'll never get is the full picture. The CIA made sure of that too. The tobacco industry cover-up. If you've ever wondered why it took so long for something everyone eventually agreed was obviously true, here's the reason. It was made uncertain on purpose, and you were the target audience. December 1953. The heads of America's largest tobacco companies meet behind closed doors in New York because new science is starting to say cigarettes cause cancer, and for the first time, you're a threat they can't out-advertise. They hire a PR strategist, John Hill, and his advice becomes the blueprint for the next 50 years. Don't deny the science to people like you, compete with it. In January 1954, you'd have opened a newspaper to a coordinated ad campaign called A Frank Statement, printed in over 400 US papers, promising the industry cared about your health and insisting the cancer link wasn't proven. Behind the scenes, they built the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, dressed up to look independent, but entirely funded by the companies it claimed to investigate. If you read a news article back then quoting a skeptical scientist, there's a real chance that scientist was handed to the reporter by the industry itself, manufacturing a debate that, internally, they already considered settled. It worked on you and everyone else for decades. The wall came down in the 1990s when insider Jeffrey Wigand went public and a flood of internal memos reached the press and Congress, including one that summed up the entire strategy in 3 words. Doubt is our product. In 1998, the industry agreed to pay over $200 billion, the largest civil settlement in US history. The strategy didn't die with the settlement though. If you've ever heard a company tell you the science isn't settled yet, you're hearing this exact playbook, recycled.
The Panama Papers. Imagine finding out the ultra-wealthy people you assumed just followed different rules. Actually just had a law firm write those rules for them. That's what landed in your lap on April 3, 2016, when 11.5 million documents leaked from a single firm. The firm was Mossack Fonseca, based in Panama, and its business was building shell companies, paper corporations built to make sure no one, including you, could ever trace who actually owned the money inside them. The leak took more than 370 journalists working in secret for over a year to untangle. What they handed you wasn't a handful of bad actors, it was a functioning system, naming 12 sitting or former heads of state and 128 other politicians and officials, alongside billionaires and criminal networks. The fallout landed fast. Iceland's prime minister resigned within days once you learned he and his wife secretly owned an offshore company tied to Iceland's collapsed banks. UK Prime Minister David Cameron faced a public firestorm over his family's offshore holdings. Names tied to Vladimir Putin's inner circle and relatives of Xi Jinping turned up in the files you were now reading about in real time. By 2019, governments had clawed back more than $1.2 billion in unpaid taxes. Panama set up a review commission led by Nobel economist Joseph Stiglitz, who quit when the government wouldn't guarantee you'd actually get full transparency. Mossack Fonseca shut down for good in 2018. The firm's gone. The system that let it hide all this from you for decades. Still standing. That's 5 down, 5 to go. And if you're still with us, go ahead and subscribe now because the next 5 hit even closer to home. The Ford Pinto scandal. You get rear-ended at a stoplight. Not violently, just enough to jolt you. Now imagine that's the moment your car explodes. That's exactly what happened to a 13-year-old named Richard Grimshaw on May 28, 1972. He was riding in a Ford Pinto with his neighbor, driving from Anaheim to Barstow, when they were hit from behind. The impact pushed the fuel tank forward into a row of bolts. The tank ruptured, and gasoline flooded the cabin. The car caught fire in seconds. The driver died days later. Richard survived with severe burns and years of surgery ahead of him. Here's what should make you angry. Ford already knew. Their own crash tests had shown the Pinto's fuel tank could rupture in rear-end collisions as slow as 28 miles per hour, a speed you'd hit pulling out of a parking lot. Engineers had a fix ready, costing about $11 per car. Ford's management rejected it. After running a cost-benefit analysis that weighed fixing every car, $137 million, against simply paying out for the deaths and injuries that would happen if they didn't, $49.5 million. On paper, you were worth less than $11 to them. In 1977, journalist Mark Dowie put that memo in front of the public for the first time. During Grimshaw's trial, a former Ford executive testified he'd raised the same concern internally and been pushed into early retirement for it. The jury awarded $125 million in punitive damages, later reduced on appeal to $3.5 million, though by then you'd already heard the number that mattered. ExxonMobil and climate change. If you've ever been told the science isn't settled on climate change, you should know Exxon's own scientists settled it internally back in 1977, decades before you ever heard the debate. That year, senior Exxon scientist James Black briefed company executives with a warning that reads almost exactly like something you'd see in headlines today. Burning fossil fuels was very likely warming the planet, with global consequences. Exxon's own research through the early 1980s went further, describing warming that could become catastrophic and irreversible if emissions weren't reduced. Exxon didn't ignore this, they funded more of it, building some of the most advanced in-house climate modeling of any company on Earth. But that's not what you were told. Starting in the mid-1980s and running for 2 decades, Exxon ran a public campaign engineered to make you doubt what their own scientists already knew: funded ads, funded research groups, industry lobbying. Between 1998 and 2004 alone, at least $16 million went to organizations built to argue with you about whether the science was even real. The gap between what Exxon knew and what they told you became the story. Investigative journalism in 2015 pulled the internal documents into the light and laid the timeline out for you to see for yourself. Facing pressure, Exxon shifted its public position, acknowledging fossil fuels' role in 2006, backing a carbon tax by 2015. Whether that shift was sincere or just better PR is still being argued in courtrooms right now. Operation Paperclip. If you'd been an American in 1945, you'd have been told the Nazi war machine was defeated and dismantled. What you weren't told is that the U.S. government quietly kept a large piece of it running and put it to work for you. After Germany's surrender, American forces seized military archives full of names, engineers and rocket scientists who'd built the regime's most advanced weapons. Instead of prosecuting them, the U.S. recruited them before the Soviets could get there first. Many had been Nazi Party members, some with direct ties to the regime's worst crimes, which should have disqualified them from ever entering the country. So their files were quietly rewritten to get them past the very people whose job was to stop exactly that. Over 1,600 scientists came over under Operation Paperclip. The most famous name you already know is Wernher von Braun, designer of the V-2 rocket, a weapon Germany used to kill thousands of civilians. In the U.S., he was handed funding and a new mission, eventually becoming chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that put astronauts on the moon. For decades, you knew him only as an American space hero. Not everyone got away with the clean rebrand forever. Arthur Rudolph ran V-2 production at a factory that worked concentration camp prisoners to death by the thousands, then spent decades quietly running programs for NASA. It wasn't until the early 1980s that investigators uncovered the truth, and in 1984, facing prosecution, Rudolph agreed to leave the country for good. You didn't get the full story until 40 years after the war had ended. The Library of Alexandria. If you've ever wondered what humanity lost before it ever got the chance to write it down twice, this is the closest you'll get to an answer, and you still won't like how incomplete it is. Founded in Egypt in the 3rd century BC, the Library of Alexandria held, by ancient accounts, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the largest concentration of human knowledge you could have found anywhere on Earth at the time. If you're picturing one dramatic fire that destroyed it all in a single night, that's not actually what happened, and that might be exactly why the truth is so hard to pin down. Julius Caesar's siege of the city in 48 BC set fire to the docks and, by some accounts, damaged part of the collection. Roman rule brought slow, steady neglect. Then, in 391 AD, A Christian bishop led the destruction of the library's affiliated temple complex as part of a broader campaign against paganism. And in 415 AD, you lose Hypatia, a mathematician and philosopher, one of the last scholars tied to the Alexandrian tradition, murdered by a religious mob in the city streets. No single villain, no single order, no one moment you can point a finger at, which made it easy for every power involved, Roman and religious alike, to avoid ever being blamed for it directly. What was lost in those centuries exists today only as titles referenced in other people's footnotes. You will never read the originals. The Katyn Massacre. Imagine your own government murdering 22,000 of your country's doctors, lawyers, and officers, then spending the next 50 years convincing the entire world someone else did it. That's not a hypothetical. That's Katyn. In 1940, Soviet secret police executed nearly 22,000 Polish officers and members of the educated class, captured after the joint Nazi-Soviet invasion of Poland the year before. Stalin signed the order himself, aiming to wipe out the leadership class that could rebuild an independent Poland. Prisoners were shot one at a time and buried in mass graves. In 1943, German forces discovered the graves and, unsurprisingly, publicized it as propaganda. Stalin's response was immediate. Deny everything, cut ties with the Polish government in exile, and blame the Nazis instead. And here's the part that should bother you. Western allies who needed Stalin's cooperation to win the war mostly let the lie stand, even while privately doubting it. The truth held for nearly 50 years. It finally broke in 1990, when Gorbachev admitted Soviet responsibility and released the documents proving it. Yeltsin later released more, showing officials had deliberately destroyed evidence in the 1950s to keep it buried. Even now, if you ask Russia, they'll call it a Stalinist-era crime, but they still won't call it a genocide, and you'll never get to see everything because some of the files remain classified. That's all 10. If even one of these got under your skin, subscribe. There's a lot more history like this that never made it into your textbook.